I'm Rain, and welcome to the Fuzz Academy. I'm here on my very comfy chair where I do a lot of my very comfy work, things like hand sewing and digital sculpting. And it's digital sculpting that I want to talk about with you today. You see, I use a program called Nomad Sculpt on my iPad to do pretty much most of my work for fursuit making, cosplay, props, fan art, that kind of stuff. I like the portability, I like the ease of use, I like the inexpensiveness of many of the apps for those kinds of things, and it's made it really useful for me in my job. I get asked about digital sculpting a lot, and while there's a lot of resources for learning Nomad Sculpt, it feels like it's a little bit more lacking when you're focusing on cosplay or fursuit making kind of efforts. And I wanted to make a video series that kind of focused on those specifics in what I do and help other people kind of bridge the knowledge gap and get a little bit more comfortable with sculpting themselves. My focus in this video series is to go from beginning terminology all the way to exporting files for 3D printing and everything in between. I'm going to focus on how to set up the program for the first time, how to use some of the more advanced tools, how to prepare a model to get ready for 3D printing, including things like scale and removal of the interior, stuff like that's a little bit more complicated, but super important if we're going to be using these things for cosplays and fursuit. This first video is going to be focusing on terminology and just setting up the program. I know that it can be a little bit difficult when you get into a new program. All the presets are in specific ways and may not make sense when you're getting started, and it can be a little overwhelming to set up that workspace for the first time. But I'll clear all my settings in Nomad Sculpt and start all over so that I can help you figure out exactly where things should go and maybe an insight into how you want to sculpt your own workspace. In the second video, I'll be focusing on sculpting. I'll be making a dog fursuit head, so you can see how I work when I'm making 3D models. We'll go through all of the tools I use and the deeper settings in those tools so that you can learn to use them however you need to for your own projects. On the final video, we'll be focusing on advanced tools, things like Boolean and quad remeshing, stuff that's super important to know to really get that model polished. We're also going to focus on things to keep in mind when you're exporting for printing. There is a lot of things to think about to keep models reasonable in size and printable, to keep them in the right scale when you're exporting them, stuff like that. And we're going to be focusing on that in our final video. So with that, I want to get started on some basics. We're going to discuss a little bit about terms and info, about what modeling is, and then we're going to dive right into presets in the program. All right, so now I've got my iPad and Nomad Sculpt is open. We're going to go through a couple of terms real quick just to be on the same page about things I might say, things that are important when you're doing 3D modeling. So first up, it's mesh. A mesh is a series of points connected by line segments that create the shape that we are looking at. So if I turn on the wireframe on this, we are able to then see the individual points and then the line segments that connect those, and then the planes that are connected between those line segments to create the shapes. The next one is primitive. A primitive is a shape created by the software that we'll be using to create our sculptures with. So if I go in here into the scene tab and add a primitive, you'll see here there's a bunch of different shapes: box, sphere, cylinder, and we use those as a building block to create our sculptures. The next two terms I want to talk about go hand in hand. They're quads and tris. If we zoom into this model, you'll see that each of these shapes is made up of a four-sided square. Those are called quads. They have four sides. And the different version of that is called a tri when it has three sides. If I go in here, change my topology to be dynamic and add a brush in here, you can see that it might switch some of these into tris, three-sided objects. You can see that it switches some of these into tris, three-sided objects. And then finally, the last term I want to bring up is topology. Topology has to do with these quads and tris and how they're arranged to create the shapes that we're using in our meshes. We'll be making more or less detailed topology depending on how complicated what we're doing is at the time. But typically we want to keep our topology very simple, because the more faces there are, the more memory it takes to work on it, the more memory it takes to save it and use it later in prints and that kind of thing. All right, so now we've done some of our basic terminology. We'll be discussing more of that later as we introduce new tools and stuff. But for now, I want to dive into what the buttons at the top of the page do and how do we set this program up to use it the first time and set ourselves up for success. The first button that we'll see is just the Nomad icon there. It is got a couple of features in here that could be useful. Turntables for showing off what you're doing, recording screenshots, that kind of thing. The manual link is right there, so if you have any deeper questions, it's a great place to go and do some more research and learn about the insides of the tools and what they can do. And then languages are also important here. The second is Project tab. The Project tab is where we start new files, we save old files, we import new geometry into existing files from older files. We can also export things for 3D printing and other work. So it's a super important tab. The most important thing on here, you want to make sure you have turned on, is your autosave feature. I think it defaults to being on right now, but if it's not, you'll want to make sure your autosave is turned on. I keep mine for 5 minutes because it's super helpful to have that backed up all the time, but you'll want to make sure it's on because Nomad Sculpt, like many other pieces of software, can crash, and you really don't want to lose hours of work to a crash like that. There's also things like add to scene. This is a really important add button. Inside here, other notable things are renaming the document. So I can be like, let's go class. I can also add to scene, which is where I import from other Nomad documents into this one. I can import from save files down here and do some advanced things, and then exporting. But we're going to talk a little bit more about exporting towards the end of the third video. Up next is our scene tab. This is how we add new geometry. We can also set in or mess around with whether or not we see old stuff, see which one we're working on, that kind of thing. And we're going to go into this a little bit more later too. But notice that we're going to be spending a lot of time adding things in here. And then the Boolean function is also here, which we'll talk about a bunch later. The next tab has to do with whether or not we have our model in dynamic topology or multi-resolution mode. Basically, when we're working in our mesh, we need to be able to adjust things, make things more or less dense as we're working. And this tab is how we set that up. Multi-resolution allows us to divide structures deeper, smaller and smaller based on clicking this subdivide button. Dynamic topology allows us to draw and have the topology change dynamically as we're drawing and working. I typically like to just keep mine in multi-resolution, though if I'm doing something detailed, I'll switch into dynamic and then adjust on the fly. Next thing is our material. For the sake of what we're doing, I typically don't mess with materials a whole lot. If we're making finished models that we're using as a visual only, not necessarily printing, it can be really cool to finish off things in this kind of model. But what we're going to be focusing on here, since I'm going to be focusing on things for 3D printing, I'm not going to detail too much into what this is and how it works. Next up is our shading. It might start in this lit PBR mode for you, but you want to make sure you have it in matte cap. I typically like it that way because it's a little easier to see what you're sculpting on by keeping it simple. And you can choose what material you're using in this. I typically use like a clay. This is my personal favorite, though there's a lot of fun ones that are kind of fun to use. So like find one that you find inspiring. But personally, I tend to like this clay one. I think that's because I used to do a lot more work with clay, and working from that perspective is kind of nice for me. Up next, there's some processing tab, quality tab. We're not going to be doing anything with that because we're not rendering things. The image tab, the background tab, allows us to add images into the background. We can also change our colors in the background if we have anything we want in particular. But this is just an aesthetic choice. Nothing really major is needed here. And then the camera tab. This camera tab can allow us to preset some camera settings so that if we want to get back to a specific spot, say we have a reference image behind our sculpt, and we want to get things set back up to exactly how that was so we can refer to that reference image directly in scale, that camera will allow us to create views that we can go between to get exactly those spots set up. On the next side, there is a settings button for any tool that you are currently using. That changes dynamically based on what tool you're with. So we won't play with that too much now until we get into actually messing with brushes and different tools. The next one is the brush settings. You'll see there's a bunch of different settings in there that you can play with when you're dealing with your sculpting brushes, stuff like that. I'll discuss that a little bit more later, but for now, just know that it's there. And if you're wanting to change settings within a brush and how it works, that's where you're going to do that. Up next is a painting specific tab. We're not going to talk about that here because that's more for rendering. Symmetry is a super important tab. I use this one all the time, and as I often work in symmetry, a fursuit head is going to often have two different sides that mirror each other, and even sculptures often all start in symmetry, make this shape symmetrical, and then adjust it accordingly based on how I feel it should look if things aren't symmetrical. But I really like to have symmetry enabled. So in here, I'm able to do that. You can choose which plane you're setting it to, but I typically will have it on the X plane here. Operations, we're not going to deal with right now, and layers as well. All right, so the next tab here is the display settings. In here, there's a ton of different information that you might want to turn on or off depending on the context. Things like seeing a grid in the background or being able to see the planes can be super useful. The wireframe can be accessible here if it's not set to the bar at the bottom. And most importantly, I like to keep on the stats that's over here on the right. And I tend to like to have smooth shading on. A lot of the work I'm doing is going to be smooth and clean, and I like to be able to see that a little bit more rounded and nice like that. If I scroll down, I like to show the small dot and the lazy rope stabilizer, which are on by default. And if I scroll down, I'll have the snap cube on. The snap cube is this little cube in the top. It lets you rotate things on planes specifically. So if you want to look at it from the front, but a little bit down, but not any of the sides, you can grab the front here and rotate it accordingly. You can also hit, like, if you're lost in the model or it's gone somewhere, you can hit home and it'll just default to centered on the front with everything inside the boundaries of the image. The stats I like to keep on, I typically keep them in the top left corner, but you can put them wherever you want in your personal setup. Finally, there's one more tab that we're going to look at, and this is going to have a lot of our presets and things we're going to have to change to make it be just the way we want it to be. For me, I typically turn off the undo and redo functions on the shortcuts because with Nomad Sculpt, if I do some work, I'm moving things around here. If I want to undo, I can tap with 2 fingers as the default, and I can redo with 3 fingers. So I'll just be doing that instead of doing the undo, redo shortcuts. But if you prefer having the buttons for them, you can have them down there as well. I do like to have solo on, just because it helps me if I have a bunch of different meshes. Say I go over here and I open this guy here. You'll see that I have a lot of different meshes here. And if I want to just work on one part, I can click on it and then hit solo, and that'll make it so all I can see is just that mesh. So solo is kind of important. X-ray is also important. It's similar to solo in that it isolates what mesh you're currently working on, but you can still see the other things and how they interact with that mesh. So it can be useful if you're wanting to isolate and work on some weird sections of geometry that are hidden behind something else. You can use that to help you see only what you're looking for. Up next is the grid. I like to have grid on down here just in case. Sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not. The voxel I turn off. Anytime I need to use voxel meshing, I'll change it up here in this tab. but voxel mesh is not really something I use a whole lot. So not something I need there. I turn off the inspector. I do like to keep the face group on. I'll talk about what face groups are a little bit later. It's a little bit more advanced, but it's helpful to keep that one on because sometimes you just need to be able to toggle it really quickly. And then as I go down, I'm going to change, you can change some presets in the colors here of the program. If you prefer anything else, you can just do that. I typically like the third one. That's just because I think it's what it defaulted to when I first got the program. As I scroll down, I'm going to mirror the sidebars. I'm left-handed, so having the brushes and everything set to this side over here is super useful. And then I can use my right hand to adjust the tools on this side here. These tools over here adjust the size and intensity of the tool you're currently using. So it's nice to be able to use my right hand and adjust those on the fly while I'm brushing and things like that. Scrolling down, everything else I keep the same here. Next up is the gestures tab. In this, we can change how our pen, how our hands all interact with the software. First off is the camera. I typically have the camera set to just be the finger. I'll turn off stylus and mouse. So now if I'm moving things around, I can just use it with my hand and not the pen. For the sculpture, I'll turn off the finger and mouse. I don't have a mouse at all, so I typically just turn everything off on the mouse. But the sculpt being just the stylus means that now I can't mess with that with my finger when I'm moving things around, but I can mess with it with my pen. Third is the gizmo tool. The gizmo I have only with the stylus. Just because I like to make sure that I can move around in the same way in the space. The gizmo tool will allow me to do things like adjust the sizes of things and rotations. And when I have this on with the finger, sometimes it messes with me trying to grab things and move things around. It's not as precise as the stylus either, so that's why I'll just have that on with the stylus. Material picking isn't something I care too much about, but you can do that with the long press. And selecting the object I typically have with both the finger and the stylus. Sometimes I'll be switching between things and it's not as big a deal. It's not as likely to mess things up as like having the finger on for drawing and for movement. Scrolling down, I'm going to go down to the 3 fingers mode. You can change your lighting and stuff with this, but I typically have that one turned off. Because I'm not messing with lighting very much. The tool radius and the tool intensity, you can actually adjust with your fingers. You see it's getting bigger there, or you can make it more or less intense, and you can see that changing on the right over there. You can have that set up to 3 fingers. If I remember to use it, I'll use it. I think it's a nice little convenient shortcut. It works pretty quickly with the software. You can see here the history is 2 fingers. If you 2-finger tap, you can go backwards 1. If you 3-finger tap, you can go forwards 1. If you hold the 2 fingers down on the tap, it'll go backwards a bunch until you let go. If you hold the 3 fingers down, it'll go forwards a bunch until you let go. So good to know for your history. Roll on the stylus is something they've added with the newest Apple Pen. It can be really helpful if you're doing things like moving stuff and you want to add a roll into it. So we're going to go into that a little bit more later as to exactly how that works. But if I make this big and obvious, you can see here that as I roll the pen, it deforms the shape according to that roll. I think that's super helpful, and it's one of the huge advantages in the iPad's Nomad Sculpt, because sometimes some of these softwares, it's really hard to get that rotation in there as you're sculpting. That's it for this tab. Bindings, I don't typically use a whole lot of these. I have one set up on my pen double tap to change it between hard and soft shading. So you can see right now it's hard and then it's soft, hard, soft. And it's basically just smoothing it out just so I can see the geometry a little bit better. When you're printing something, it's not going to print with the smooth geometry. It's going to print hard. So it's nice to know if you need to increase the topology to make it a little bit more complicated to even things out. You can change that. You can see that with this view. But ultimately, I prefer having it rounded because it helps me see what I'm doing. Finally, there's a debug thing in here. Well, I don't ever use that at all, so we won't even touch it. And then last but not least, now that I've kind of got the interface how I want it to be, on the top buttons, I'm going to look to the left here and grab and move a bunch of things based on what I want. You'll see that the bottom has this little tab that you can pull it out. I like to keep it in a vertical orientation like this, but for the sake of making it a little bit easier to see what I'm working on, I'm going to grab it here and open it up all the way. And it's going to go left to right, top to bottom as it's working. There's some of these that I don't ever use, so I'm going to put them at the bottom as I work my way down. Move the select mask down here. I'm going to keep the mask up there. I'll move the flatten up a bit. Right there. Move, drag, clay. I actually don't use, I'll put it right there. Clay I'll use there. Mask I'll keep. Paint I'll move down to the bottom. Trim I keep. Crease and pinch I like. Layer I'll keep up here with this. Split I'll drop down here. Project I'll drop down here. Stamp I don't ever use. Delete layer I don't really use. Lathe is not that great. Insert can be useful, but not the most because I'll just insert from the top. Tube I'll use. Transform I'll move down here. Gizmo is one of my favorites, so I'll put that at the top. Quad remesher is more important than most of these things. Face group is, I'm going to move up behind quad remesher. Crease and pinch. I'll put these up here. Measure is not important. Tube is important. Right there. Yeah, so that should be pretty much it as far as the side goes. I might change things as I work my way through the software later, but being able to scroll through this covers everything. Though there are some repeated things on the right side of the interface that can allow us to change, adjust things. Things like the mask and smooth are all on the right side all the time. Same thing with Gizmo. So I might not use those as much, but this kind of is a personal preference thing. Once you know where your tools are, it's usually pretty good to keep them there so that you can find them easily, and then adjust things in small amounts until you're super happy with what you've got. And this might also change depending on what you use more as time goes on. Hey, I'm cutting in here. It's been a few weeks since I recorded that last set of videos. And I wanted to jump in and say a few things that I've changed in how I work. I've been doing some fan art and making some more projects and really focusing on the tool orientation and like optimizing it a little bit more with this video in mind. And I wanted to give an update before this video went live as to what changes I've made. First up, on the left tab here with all the tools, I learned that there are folders and you can hide certain things. So if I want to create folders, maybe I want to have a painting folder. What you can do is click on the item. There we go, once it's selected, and you can click this here, move it to a folder. In here, you can choose folders you have existing or a new one. You'll see I have a painting and an unused one. You can access that if your bar is wide by hitting these tabs. See, there's the painting, there's the unused. Or you can click that and go to each one of those. You'll also notice I have an unused tab, and what I've done with that is if you click on the Nomad icon there and you click turn off show all, now we can see that this is all that I have remaining. This is all I have showing for me when I'm actually doing my art. So I like that so much nicer. You can also see that I got rid of a few or moved them way down. Quad remesher I moved way down, smooth and gizmo and mask I moved way down, and that's because they're all on this side over here. So in this area I've got my smooth, mask, hide, and gizmo. What's really cool about these is if I'm going in here and I grab something here, also this is what we're working on in the future, so spoilers, if I grab something here and I want to like brush, mess with it a little bit, I can smooth it with the smooth tool on the right side there. And then if I click that tool again, it goes back to the brush. As opposed to using the tool on the left, if I click the smooth tool, I have to click back on the brush tool. super nice if you have your offhand, able to just click between the two really fast. And it works for the mask, gizmo, and hide as well. So I found that to be pretty useful. And then the other half of what I wanted to break in here and say was in the top right here in the add shortcuts, I played around with bindings. This little 3 dots here opens up a whole new menu of things. And these are all different presets of tools that you can use. And there's a ton of them in here. So if you're wanting to do things that you find there's something you do a lot and you want to be able to do it quickly, say like you want a Boolean operation or you want to add new primitives super quickly, you might be able to put that down here. You can see that I added quad remesher and same remesh down here. And then you can use the order tab here to change the order in which the items are. So you're able to grab them, move them around. You'll see that they change down the bottom there. And you can reset the order as well. But I found that to be super useful. I've added in subdivide, and I'll go into why I use that there in the second video. And I've added same and quad remesher in here as well. Those both have to do with the quad remesher. And that's the third video that I'll be talking about those directly. But I wanted to jump in here before we moved on further, just so you could see what I have now set up, in what order, just for your own sake. So it might make it easier for you in the future. Now, I didn't have these in the future videos that you'll be seeing. I had it in the other mode before, but this is how I have it set up now. So maybe that'll be helpful for you. All right, see you soon. So yeah, now our tools are all in the right place. We know a little bit about where things are located on the top of the software, and we should be able to go in next video and start sculpting. So with that, we're done with the first lesson here on Nomad Sculpt. Thanks for coming. After the video, there's going to be a list of Patreon sponsors that I wanted to give a big shout out to. If you want to support me on Patreon, there's a link down below, and the next video will be coming up in the next couple of weeks once I get it all edited and posted. If you want to see it a little bit early, it'll be on the Patreon. Thank you for joining me today, and if you like my video, make sure to like it, leave a comment, subscribe, that kind of stuff, and I'll see you next time here on the Fuzz Academy. Bye.